Hi everybody, welcome to our short presentation on biocontrol of St John's wort. Firstly, a quick introduction to eco-insects. We were established back in 2023, so we're only a couple of years old, and we really kicked off as a result of the work we were doing in the dung beetle area. We got heavily involved with some work with MLA, and this resulted in eco-insects being formed to distribute all the dung beetles that had come out of that program, as well as try and help our industry put more dung beetles out where they were needed. Tonight, however, we're going to talk about St John's wort and St John's wort beetle. And for that, I'm joined by Russ Barrow. Russ, why don't you take it from here?
Yeah, thanks very much, Paul. Welcome to this short webinar, which we hope will become a fairly regular occurrence so that we can build up a library of infomercials or information for people to listen to. So Paul's already introduced the company. Let's move on to the task at hand, which is St John's wort. St John's wort's also known biologically, scientifically, as Hypericum perforatum. You can see the plant in the bottom right-hand corner there. It's a perennial plant. It's there all year round. In spring, it goes to aerial growth, and about now, October, November, you'll see a massive yellow flower start to develop. If you cast your attention across to the map on the left-hand side, you can see it's fairly well distributed across temperate Australia, from the Queensland border, southern Queensland, all the way down through New South Wales and almost completely covering Victoria. There's also quite a lot of St John's wort in Western Australia and Tasmania. Southeast South Australia also suffers from the growth of this perennial weed. So it's widely dispersed across grazing regions of southern Australia. Now, it's toxic to livestock. Often people will say, well, why are you getting rid of St John's wort? It's got medicinal properties. Well, the medicinal properties are due to a chemical called hypericin, and that chemical, when exposed to sunlight, causes photosensitization. That happens in humans just as much as it does in livestock. So the medicinal properties of St John's wort may work quite well in European climates where you don't get a lot of sunlight. But if you are a person who drinks a lot of St John's wort tea, you should also be careful, because it is also toxic to humans. It can cause photosensitization, blistering, and in animals who then can't be convinced not to scratch, ulceration, and it can lead to death of animals. The plant is helped by droughts, by overgrazing, and by poor pasture growth. That's hindered by strategic grazing and pasture competition. So you can graze St John's wort at certain times of the year, and if you keep good pasture growth, the other plants can outcompete it. So we've got management strategies to deal with it, or at least try to manage it. It is difficult to manage, though. Let's not get around that. It is difficult to manage, especially in those less accessible areas, perhaps creek lines, forested areas, or lightly wooded areas, and of course on hilly terrain. Even if you do get rid of it, it's very quick to spread back. The seed bank can lay in the ground and remain dormant for a decade. So it's a long-term strategy to manage and control. I think we're beyond eradication, but to control St John's wort. This little chart we produced, and we've put it into one of our sheets that are available, and it goes through the control strategies for each of the seasons. There's no reason we start in spring. I suppose we often think of spring because that's when we're dealing with the distribution of our St John's wort beetles. But the plant is well established in spring, and it's when it becomes aerial. So you'll see basal growth of this perennial plant throughout winter. Comes September, very rapidly, this basal growth of the plant goes aerial, goes vertical, and very rapidly you'll get flower heads developing. And now in early November, late October, early November, we're starting to get the flowering of the wort. At that stage, it is not suitable for grazing, and it should be, your stock should be avoiding it. It can cause a photosensitization, particularly at this time of the year. As summer comes, the beetles that may be on the plant stop feeding. So in late December through January, they stop feeding and they go into this period. It's called estivation. You can see it there in the column under summer. Essentially, that's the summer equivalent of hibernation, where beetles escape the heat. They go to the ground or sit under flower heads and wait for the cooler months of February, March, April, when they start to lay eggs. So they've eaten throughout spring. There is a short period in summer where they stop eating. The beetles return to eating in autumn. That's the March, April. They lay the eggs and they will then die. So the adult beetles that you've observed then die. That's their life cycle complete. But the larvae hatch from the eggs, and the larvae continue to feed on the St John's wort throughout the later autumn and winter months. So you're getting control not only from the beetles, the adult beetles, but also from the larval stages of beetles. So the larvae continue to feed throughout winter, and they then pupate and emerge as beetles again, completing the life cycle at the adult form. Now, if you look at the actions along the bottom row of that, you can see that in spring, it is recommended to do spot spraying, mechanical removal, and to avoid grazing, as I've already noted. Spot spraying again in summer, avoid grazing. In autumn, you can do targeted grazing, and you can also do that in winter. The sheep or the cattle will ingest a lot less of the material because there is a lot less of it around. The plant has gone to the dormant, the senescent seed heads, which you'll see in a photograph in a minute. The vision for eco insects is to get as many of the St John's wort beetles out into the environment as possible. The beetles have been in Australia for quite a period of time, but they've been poorly managed, and that has led to a sparse distribution of these beetles throughout the grazing environments. So we're now trying to convince graziers, land managers, to employ the St John's wort beetle, whether that be the Chrysalina hypericide, which is known as the lesser St John's wort beetle, or Chrysalina quadrigemina, which is known as the greater St John's wort beetle. Both of them target the hypericin species and only those species, so you're not going to get it eating other plants in your pasture environment, in your grazing environment. They can do an extraordinary job when they're in large numbers. They can entirely defoliate St John's wort and basically prevent the plant from going to seed. So with an integrated pest management strategy where you're using cultivation or mechanical removal, along with spraying, along with biological control, you can get effective control of this weed. Here's the life cycle. So where should we start? Maybe we should go right to the bottom and look at March. So in March, the beetles are mating. They're basically at the end of their life cycle, as I pointed out. They mate and they'll lay eggs on the underside of the St John's wort leaves. If you look at your plants in March, April, you might see masses of these little orange dots under the leaves. This is the underside of the leaves. Remember, you have to turn them over. They're the eggs of the St John's wort beetle. Whether they're the lesser or the greater St John's wort beetle, they both look similar. Give those eggs a couple of weeks and they will hatch into a larvae. And the larvae is just the grub. It's the caterpillar form, if you want to think of it, of the St John's wort beetle. It, like most of these grubs, will feed on the St John's wort, and it will do that throughout the later autumn and winter months. They then pupate, and in pupation, they go through metamorphosis. These beetles undergo complete metamorphosis, and they emerge as the adult form, which are the beautifully coloured. They're either bluey green or most commonly bronze in coloration, St John's wort beetles. As they emerge, generally in early October, you will start to see defoliation of the plants. And we can see in areas where you've got good populations of St John's wort beetle, complete defoliation. So this essentially removes the capacity of the plant to undergo photosynthesis. The plant doesn't have the energy to produce seed heads. It, in that year, is incapable of producing seed. It doesn't necessarily kill the strong plants. Young plants will die, but older plants have got a strong root system, and they may then shoot further growth, but it won't be producing seed. So again, a longer term strategy is to make sure that you've got this integrated pest management approach to controlling your wort. If you've missed the mechanical, chemical, or biological control, you'll get to January, which is that photograph in the bottom right-hand side. You can see the stray flower there, but essentially what you've got are sticky seed pods all over the St John's wort plant. Now, we've actually counted these, and you can have anywhere from 500 to 800,000 of these sticky pods on a single plant. In each of these pods is anywhere from 25 to 30 seeds. Again, we've cracked these open and counted them, as others have. So if we do 25 seeds per pod, and let's just assume there's 1,000 pods on a plant, that means each plant is producing 25,000 seeds, which can fall to the ground and remain dormant for a decade. So the control of the weed is a long-term strategy, but if each year you can control the flowering, such as we've done by defoliation, then you do have a viable strategy to prevent the weed from propagating and eventually control its growth. This is a short video. I'll just press play and you'll see these beetles chewing through the St John's wort. On the right-hand side, you can see one of the beetles oblivious to the fact that we're filming, and he's just munching his way through the leaf. And over a period of 10 to 12 hours, these beetles in captivity, this is done in captivity, will completely defoliate these plants. You can see the little crab spider strolling into shot at the moment. I'm sure they do take their fair share of beetles, but they outnumber them, or at least 1,000 to 1, so we'll let them have some dinner. Just to draw your attention back to this beetle here, he's halfway through the leaf. In another probably 30 seconds, he would have entirely eaten that leaf and then moved on to his next one. These beetles just are voracious eating machines of the St John's wort. Here's another video. Now, this video was taken about a week. I was back at the exact same location today, and there is absolutely no St John's wort with any leaves on it, and the beetles have moved on. So the beetles have totally defoliated this area of St John's wort and moved on to the next patch. So I'll just play the video and you'll see the density of the beetles that is possible. All of these plants have got these little black dots. They're the bronze, blue, green St John's wort beetle, and you can see the defoliation that they've done here. When we collect from an area like this, we only take 5 to 10% of the beetles to ensure that there's a population there that are going to be viable and generate beetles in the coming years. So we're quite careful in how many beetles we take from each area. So perhaps at this point, we do some key questions. Paul, do you want to MC this section?
Yeah, sure. So Russ, we've had quite a few questions either through our Facebook page or just through email, people interested in how the whole system works. So how does Eco Insects supply live insects out to farmers?
You've got Postman Pat up in the top right-hand side there. We literally post them. It's very important that we get your order as early as possible. Beetles emerge, as I've mentioned, mid-October, early to mid-October, and the collection period for us, where it's relatively easy before they start to defoliate and move on, is realistically up until the second week of November. So now, in the second week of November, the numbers are starting to drop off in our areas we collect because they've eaten all of the wort out. So we just have to travel further and further in order to be able to collect them. So if we've got your order by Friday, then we will post your beetles on a Monday or a Tuesday. We don't post after Monday or Tuesday because we can't rely on the post getting them to you by Friday, and we don't want them to sit in the mail centres over the weekend. They'll survive perfectly well for a few days when we post them. They'll come in a cardboard box. In the cardboard box will be a plastic container with some beetles and some St John's wort. They will probably have totally defoliated that St John's wort by the time you get them, but they generally travel very well, and you then simply release them with the instruction sheet guiding you that's in the box onto your St John's wort, and they'll very rapidly start to feed.
So what's the sort of pack size, and when you're packing them away, how long do they take, and is it okay if they're left at, say, the post office?
Certainly okay. I mean, if they're left in a cool environment, they'll be good. We frequently put beetles into the fridge. So in order to calm them down and try to slow down their voracious appetites, we will put them into the fridge. That's about 4 or 5 degrees Celsius, and they slow down rapidly. They don't sleep, but their movement becomes very sluggish. We've done this many times. When we move them out of the fridge, we get 100% survival. There's no troubles with cooling them down. So sitting in a post office is fine if it's cool. If it's an air-conditioned post office, that's fine. Pack size, we sell them in boxes of 500 beetles. But when you get a box, you'll see that it says Chrysalina, Quadrigemina, or St John's wort beetles, greater than 500. We tell you there's at least 500 beetles in the box. Many times we've gone out and had a good collection, and you may be getting 750 beetles, but there will be at least 500 beetles in the box.
All right, let's go to the next page there, Russ. So when and where to release? You said that Eco Insects only collects them at a very narrow sort of season of the year. Where do you put them out, and time of the day? Anything special that we should know there?
You can put them out at any stage. We don't find predation by birds. Many of our other insects, the dung beetles, are very heavily predated by birds, by foxes, by pigs. We don't see avian bird or mammal predation. What we see is a little bit of predation by other insects, and there's no way we're going to be able to stop this day or night, but it's not a problem. So you can put them out at any time of the day or the night. We tend to tell people to put them out in the evening just because the wind, if it's windy, has often died down then, and you can easily go out there and simply take the lid off your box of St John's wort beetle, and, well, you can simply tip them out next to the wort and they'll go onto it. One thing that's quite fun to do is if you get your St John's wort and bend it over and put it into your box, you'll see how rapidly the beetles from your box go onto a plant. And then you just gently take that plant out and you'll have 50 to 100 beetles sitting on the plant. Do that 4 or 5 times and all of your beetles will be on St John's wort. Instructions come with the beetles, and we often get people say, should I spread them around my paddocks? We recommend you put them concentrated into a single area because these beetles want to find each other. They aggregate, and they aggregate in order to mate. So the higher the density, the better. They'll then breed up and hopefully populate your paddocks year on year until you've got the density of beetles that we see in some of those videos. Each female beetle will lay anywhere between, say, 200 to 300 eggs. So each year, the population is increasing 200 to 300 times the female population, which is around about 50% of the beetles that you have. So you can see very rapidly 200, and then next year 200 on that 200, et cetera, et cetera. You can get to the position where you've got millions of beetles in your paddock. And we do see complete defoliation. It is possible fairly rapidly in a controlling your St John's wort. So how many should we release?
How many we release? It's also sort of linked there to, I suppose, how far apart the patches might be, or can I release them here and will they end up over the hill? How does that work on let's say small farms versus larger farms?
Mm-hmm. We always get this question: how many should we release? And my answer is you can't release too many. If they eat all of the St John's wort on your property and move on, fantastic. That's the outcome you want. But of course, budgets control how many you can release. So release as many beetles as your budget affords to control the St John's wort infestations that you have on your property. And remember, don't expect a packet of greater than 500 beetles to totally defoliate anywhere near a paddock full of wort in its first year. What you're doing is you're buying a population of beetles to seed your paddocks, and in future years, those beetles will multiply 200 times 200 times 200. So just manage your expectations in those first couple of years. The more beetles you have, the better. Now, people often say to us, I released 500 beetles, and all of a sudden there was a lot more beetles around. Yes, beetles attract beetles. So again, releasing beetles in a dense population, we've seen this time and time again, that dense populations of beetles, if there are any other beetles in your area, are attracted to the other beetles based on smell. So we're talking pheromones here, where the beetles can smell each other and they tend to aggregate with each other, obviously for breeding purposes.
And in terms of how many should we release if you've got a larger farm and you've got several paddocks with large patches, and there's, say, a bit of woodland between them, maybe some fairly steep hills like you've got in the background of your shop there?
Mm-hmm. Yep. So the beetles do best in open pasture environments. They tend not to breed very well in shaded woodland settings. Not to say we don't find them there, and they do have incursions into there and feed, but they tend not to breed. And so the density of beetles that we find in shaded areas tends not to be as high as it is in full sunlight. What was your other question there? How many should you release?
Yeah, if you've got a larger farm and patches in different places on the farm,
yep.
Should you expect them to just naturally find the other patches, or try and put a couple of boxes in each place?
Well, within reason, they will find other patches, provided you've got no forest in between. So the beetles, as I've suggested, don't like going through forested areas. They fly. They fly from St John's wort patch to St John's wort patch, but they don't fly high. They're unlikely to fly up and over trees. They'll just fly around. So they are naturally encumbered by forested, wooded areas. If you've got open pasture, they will fly into the wind. And people often think, well, don't they get blown along by the wind? Beetles are using their antennae to smell. They're essentially picking up chemicals in the air in the same way that we pick up chemicals in the air with our nose. They're picking them up with their antennae, and they're either flying to other beetles because they're attracted by the pheromones, or they're flying to the odor of the St John's wort because they want to have a feed. So just think about where you release beetles. They will fly into the wind. And again, we tell people to think about this when they're releasing for the first time onto their property. Either release at the downwind edge of your property, or better still, in the centre of a patch of St John's wort. They'll eat that out and work their way into the wind, smelling the St John's wort in the direction that the wind is coming from.
How about we go to the last slide there, Russ? So you said before a 200 times increase. We've certainly seen some pretty heavy defoliation. How would you build a strategy for a farm to incorporate beetles into their integrated management system, and have a sensible release, but also be doing other things, such as the next question there, spraying and slashing?
Yeah, okay. So I've already addressed how quickly they will breed. Your greater, let's assume you get 500 beetles. You'll get more, but there'll be 250 females in there. You can get the calculators out and do 250 times 200, and then halve that, because half of them will be female, and then times that by 200, et cetera, et cetera. You can very rapidly see you'll get exponential growth, and populations will fairly rapidly get into the millions of beetles. And that's what you should be aiming for. That's what's going to defoliate the St John's wort on your property. It says in the next point there, question, can I still spray, slash, etc.? You can certainly slash, and one of the things that we often say is, well, slash their flower heads off before they flower. Then if you cut the flower heads off, they can't set seed. So that's a good way to manage the future seed bank, is to cut the flower heads off. And people say, yes, but if I've got beetles on them, won't I kill them? I haven't seen a slasher yet that doesn't knock the beetles off the St John's wort before they go into the slasher. So the beetles, or the vast majority of beetles, have fallen to the ground before the slasher comes and takes the heads off. So as long as you're not using, something that's going to smash the ground underneath, and you're just cutting them, then yes, you can slash. Can you spray? Well, technically herbicides won't impact beetles, but indirectly they will, because if you spray where the beetles are, then you're taking away the beetles' food. If the beetles are well established where you spray, you're probably wasting your money with the spray, because the beetles will be defoliating the plants. And if you then subsequently think, oh, I'll just go and spray, the plants won't be able to take enough of chemical up in order to have an impact. So I would say be judicious, be careful about spraying, because you're either wasting your money or perhaps taking away the beetles' food. So the important thing is that you try to stop the plants from flowering. And the last question down there is, what happens when they run out of food? Well, as I found out today, when the beetles have totally eaten the food from where they are, they disappear. They move on. So in this particular example, they will have moved on to the next patch of St John's wort. Now, I didn't find where that was, but I can guarantee that it would be in the direction the wind was coming from. They'd have finished eating where they were and then flown to the next patch. The bigger question is, okay, what happens when they've eaten all of St John's? They die. They do not eat other plants. And if you're curious and want to prove this to yourself, when you get the box of St John's wort beetles, take 20 beetles and put 10 into a plastic container with some St John's wort, and put 10 into a plastic container with some other plants. You will see they do not eat the other plants. They'll eat the St John's wort and not the other plants. Now, when they're brought into the country, these were brought in many years ago, but when insects are brought into the country, they go through very strict assessments to make sure that they're not going to hit non-target species, or at least important non-target species. So in this particular instance, they're a perfectly safe biocontrol agent. They'll eat the St John's wort, and that's it.
I think we might leave it there, Russ, but just on a final note from myself, I think given some of the questions we've had around biocontrol and how biocontrol works, we should perhaps do another one of these webinars to talk a little bit more about how classic biocontrol, the release of insects or other organisms, and then sort of stepping back and letting things happen, versus what we're talking about here, which is more of an augmented biocontrol approach, where we're responding to what's happening in the environment with a management regime. I think that might make for a good next set of webinar, and anyone who's interested with questions, please email them to us.
Yeah, definitely encourage that. Yeah, definitely encourage questions. If you mail them in, then we can specifically answer questions coming from the audience.
And thanks for your time, Russ, and thank you for everyone who's listening. We should
Pleasure.
have this up on YouTube, and I'll put links out through our various other social media as well. So thank you very much.